The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lisa White coming at you from the CML headquarters office in Denver, Colorado. Hope all of you are having a really great afternoon and a great week. We appreciate your participation in today's webinar. It's all about the legislative session, what's going on, what you want to know, and our advocacy team is here ready and willing to answer any and all questions, provide you with the latest news from the Capitol. Those of you that are elected officials, if you registered, you will receive 1 university training credit, and we will be recording today's webinar and putting it under cml.org and then go to training materials. We'll get that posted by tomorrow morning. If you're not familiar with the webinar format, just let me provide you with a brief overview. You should see a control panel to the top right of the screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which if you click on that, it'll minimize the entire box. We are muting all of you for the webinar, but you can certainly ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. At this point, I'm going to turn you over to Kevin Baumer, who's CML's Deputy Director. And Kevin, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And for those of you who will have or do have questions along the way, we'll ask you to type those in and we'll get to them at the end. Certainly if there's something that we mentioned that you have a question on, type it in at the time, and then we'll come back to them all at the end. Before I start with my colleagues to start talking about some of the bills that they'll be covering, let me just give a sort of a sense of where we're at now. Today is day 101. Is that right? No, day 99, sorry. Yeah. There are 21 days left in the session. That's 3 full weeks. That means that Wednesday, May 9th will be the last day of the legislative session. We certainly don't discourage the legislature from adjourning earlier than that, but it's highly unlikely that that will ever happen. So we have a saying around here at CML, there are 2 halves to the legislative session, the first 100 days and the last 20, because things start moving fast and furious. I know that I was scrambling to get back here just now, and my colleagues are working on things that are fairly volatile and moving quickly here at the end of the session, as is often the case. It'll get even more hectic in about 10 or 11 days as the General Assembly begins suspending rules that are usually meant, that are meant to keep things on a slower track, but when you get towards the end and in the last 3 days, they suspend all the rules so that things can move quickly. That includes calendar notifications and such. So there will be a lot of acceleration towards the finish line, which is good on some issues and maybe not so good on others. We'll be talking about some of those bills that we're watching here at the end. You're looking at CML's homepage. I hope it's not a new thing to you, but if it is, www.cml.org. And in the top bar, there are links to a lot of different things. I always want to point out, even though it's not part of the script, on the issues page, I'm just going to click on it real quick. If there's a particular issue that you're interested in, go there first. We post a lot of things on there. We're in the process, always in the process of cleaning out outdated things. But if there's something you're interested in, you can open up a specific topic and you can see some of the things that we have posted on our website. We're going to be over here on the legislative page, and in particular the 2018 legislative session. On this page, on the right-hand side, we always have our box score of support and opposed bills. And I'll be clicking here on the list of all bills followed by CML in a second, the House of any House bills, any Senate bills, which includes our support and opposed bills, but also those that we're neutral on that we watch in case of municipal impact. We have our 2018 legislative priorities you can click on. Those were delivered to legislators at the beginning of the session. I know they all read them diligently and have made all their decisions based off of CML's legislative priorities. Also, CML State House report, this is something you can go to at any time. Many of you may receive the weekly email, but if you click on the State House report, that is at least as our most recent update, and you can see when the most recent updates to a particular issue were, what the status of the bill was and how we're describing it. So that is always available to you It may be a little bit dated. We update it on Fridays before we send out the State House Report email, which includes the video if you've not watched that, and then previous editions of the State House Report if you want to look back and see where we're at. At the very bottom, and sometimes folks miss this because it is at the bottom, but we do post our position papers that support opposed bills, position papers on bills that are no longer with us, and position papers on bills that have already been signed by the governor. We'll have to come through and update those again shortly. I also want to highlight, for those of you that are interested in the current status of transportation funding, which Morgan will be talking about shortly. Morgan just drafted an excellent memo that's still accurate as of today on where things are at, particularly with two separate pieces of legislation and how they relate to potential fall ballot initiatives. So please do visit that. I'm going to go up here to the list of House bills. I'm going to open that window as well as open the Senate bill window so I can click back and forth. And I'm going to start by turning it over to my colleague, Megan Dollar, who will be talking about some of her bills. Megan.
Thank you, Kevin. Megan Dollar here. I'm going to start with a follow-up piece of legislation. Some of you probably recall HB 171313 that was deemed as reforms to civil asset forfeiture and the process by which law enforcement utilizes that tool either with the federal government or partnering with other agencies. CML did oppose that bill, however, it did pass. And so House Bill 1020 is a bill that culminated the work of a task force that met in the interim to identify opportunities for law enforcement funding, better opportunities to clarify when the reporting needs to be done, which is required under 1313. Also gives a better share back in the state system for law enforcement and provides some opportunities for grants for community policing as well. CML supports that legislation. Unfortunately, one of the original Senate sponsors has opted to take his name from the bill, which could potentially put the bill in some trouble. It is currently in Senate State Affairs. We're working diligently with the hopes that it will pass. However, that is not a given, so that may be something that we'll need to tackle hopefully again next year. House Bill 1325, that has to do with funding, additional funding to the state's digital trunked radio system. Just as a quick reminder, DTRS is a statewide two-way radio system for first responder voice communications. A lot of our municipalities utilize this. This was a joint budget committee bill, and what this did was direct the Office of Information and Technology to work in partnership with local and regional government entities to build additional radio towers to cover the gaps that we are experiencing right now in DTRS, and they did set aside $2 million as well.
And just to note, so what you're looking at on the screen, not on the calendar, this one has passed both the House and Senate, so it's next up. Unless there were any amendments in the Senate as to the governor's desk.
Absolutely, this is on its way to the governor, so that's good news for us. HB 181353, this is the follow-up to House Bill 1309, which requires council and municipal court on the first appearance. When the governor let that bill pass without his signature, or become law without his signature, he directed the legislature and OSPB to fund the unfunded mandate by that bill, and HB 181353 creates the program in order to do that. CML staff we have secured the funding in the budget. The governor set aside $2 million, so it will be around $2 million depending on the cost that DOLA needs to implement the program. But we hopefully that bill has passed House Judiciary, and we are waiting to go ahead and get it appropriated in House Appropriations. Moving down to the Senate, and I'll give Kevin some time so he can switch over. All right. Senate Bill 007, that is the Low-Income Affordable Housing Tax Credit. This is actually reauthorizes an existing state tax credit that's utilized for affordable housing gap funding. This is usually partnered in conjunction with the federal low-income housing tax credit to leverage more dollars for developers and governmental entities and nonprofits to build more affordable housing. And that program, since its existence in 2015, I think it was, has actually contributed directly to over 4,000 affordable housing units. So a really important program that is awaiting House appropriations, but we expect it's already had its appropriation in the Senate, so we expect that bill to pass. Senate Bill 66 actually just passed its second chamber on third reading yesterday, so it is on its way to the governor. This is the bill to extend the operation of the state lottery division. CML supports this bill because the state lottery division divvies up lottery dollars and through GOCO and the Conservation Trust Fund, and without that entity, we would have issues getting dollars and grant money for parks and recreation in our municipalities. So that's a very important bill that's passed the legislature. Senate Bill 191, this is particularly for those of you that are surrounding gaming communities. This has to do with the Local Government Limited Gaming Impact Fund. Right now, the Impact Fund receives $5 million of gaming revenues annually that goes directly to fund municipalities that are impacted by gaming communities. So whether that's public safety, police force, you name it, they can get grant funding from that. What this bill does is, currently it's capped at $5 million. What Senate Bill 191 does is allow the fund to grow with inflation. And so if the state portion grows, then the local government limited gaming impact fund will grow as well. So we're absolutely supportive of that legislation. Finally, I want to talk about Senate Bill 203, which has to do with municipal courts. This is a bill that CML negotiated with the ACLU. As introduced, the negotiated version had several options for municipalities to gain what the ACLU was looking for, which is independent, conflict-free public defense and municipal courts. Key options being access to alternate defense counsel, opportunities to get evaluations for defense counsel from ADC, an option for municipal courts to do their own independent commission, and there are some other options as well in there. As it was amended in Senate Judiciary, so it looks very different right now to how it was introduced. Senate Judiciary made the bill basically permissive for municipal courts. CML was neutral on the introduced version. We're neutral on the version as it is now. However, we expect that the bill in the House will certainly go back to the introduced version with some changes that CML has asked for as well. And we will likely support that amendment in order to, just in the spirit of good faith. And since we did make a compromise with the ACLU on that piece of legislation. That bill is on its way to the House as we speak. It has passed the Senate, so see more to come on that as well. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. Shall I just direct it?
Great job, Megan. Okay. If anyone has any questions on any of those bills that Megan talked about, or anything else that you know Megan is following, then feel free to post a question or contact Megan directly. Now it's Diane's turn.
Thanks, Kevin. Diane Criswell, and I've got one bill that's, two bills that have been enacted, and then some bills that are still in play. So in order, starting with the House bills, House Bill 1022 is the bill that came out of the Sales Task Force, directing the Department of Revenue to issue a request for information for tax administration kind of vendor folks. So that bill passed both chambers, I believe, late in February, and the Department of Revenue is out on the street with their request for information. So if you are home rule self-collecting, I've been reaching out to your excellent colleagues in the tax administration community, and we'll have more information about the responses to that RFI, hopefully July or so, although I just note that procurement rules likely limit the amount of information that is available about those submissions. Next is...
Before you move on, this is an opportunity to point out on the bill logs, when you're looking at these, how they work, and on this one you'll note that the governor signed House Bill 1022 on March 1st, which is a good thing. Got that one done early. The field next to Diane's name in that column is we enter that manually so that it's visible right up front. On the far side, on the far right, that whole column is automatically populated by our vendor that provides the service. So sometimes you may see that something is signed or postponed indefinitely. We may not have gotten in and updated the column next to our names, but there's two places to check on the current status of the bill. Sorry, Diane, go ahead.
Thank you. The next bill is House Bill 1128. This is protections for consumer data privacy, and some of you may know this as the data breach bill. It's scheduled in House Appropriations on Thursday. It was being held because it does have a fiscal note on it. I understand that the sponsors are intending on making amendments probably on second reading. We have provided some feedback about what may improve the bill from an implementation side to the sponsors, and I'll be interested to see how that feedback, as well as any other feedback primarily from healthcare providers and other custodians of healthcare information, have concerns about the bill. So we'll kind of see where that goes. Our current position on the bill is neutral. The next bill is House Bill 1138. This is Public Official Oaths and Affirmations. This was a bill out of the Statutory Revision Committee that came from a bill last year where the state engineer is required to take an oath and post a personal surety bond, or used to be required, and had not done so in several years. So there was legislation last year to remove those requirements, and it got some of the legislators thinking about how to make more uniform both the requirement of public officials to take an oath as well as post personal surety bond. So for those of you that are in statutory cities and towns, I worked closely with the clerks on this proposal. It provides kind of some template language and one uniform process for oaths. If you're in a home rule, you likely already have provisions in your charter or your ordinances, and those would govern any oaths. However, if you don't, and you don't want to follow what the state is doing, you may need to take action. The next bill is 1190. This is an extension of the tax credit that provides resources for the Main Street Revitalization Act. It's stuck in House Appropriations with all the other tax breaks. And if your municipality has an interest in this program, if you've received funding or would like to do so, receive funding in the future, please reach out to me. I can get you the information for the legislators that are on House Appropriations, the Joint Budget Committee, as well as contacts in the governor's office. The next bill is 1383. This is a bill that modifies current statutory requirements for payment assurance bonds for public projects. This extends that bonding requirement for P3 type projects, and by P3 I mean public-private partnerships. I was able to work with the proponents to get a lot of the technical issues with early drafts solved, and CML is currently neutral on the bill. Senate Bill 107 passed. That is repeal nomination for vacancies in petitions. That's just a good little cleanup. Nobody's using it in statutory cities and towns, I understand, so if you have questions about that bill, let me know. There's also another cleanup bill out there to be aware of. This is Senate Bill 233. This is kind of what I would term an omnibus elections cleanup. It's all in Title I. It will require anybody on the municipal side who has adopted specific deadlines related to coordinated elections to make sure that they reconcile to these new slightly different dates in the bill if the bill is enacted. The last issue that I wanted to quickly mention is there is a proposal to do, I've got two more things to mention, I'm sorry. You may have heard about a proposal to require peace officer internal investigations to be subject to CORA. We are currently deeply engaged with a coalition that's made up of other governmental entities and public safety law enforcement folks, and we are really working on that issue. One thing I'd note is I think there's probably a lot of momentum on the transparency side, on those advocates, to make some level of information related to internal investigations open to public inspection. Whether or not that bill will pass this year, considering how late it is in the game, one might not think that it would pass this year, but you never know at this time of year. So I really appreciate those folks who have provided me with technical input. I don't know where our members are at on any bill that would be introduced. Well, so heads up. The last thing is Senate Bill 247. That's a bill that was introduced just a couple of days ago that would set up a voluntary program in the state treasurer's office for fire and police to provide contributions to support a survivor's benefit for line of duty death, extending health and medical for a year. Now, what I'd say is it is not a mandatory program. What I just note for some of you, line of duty deaths are far too common, but they do not happen every year. They do not happen in every municipality. And I imagine that some of you elect to extend those medical and dental benefits to a family for a year anyway, or you may choose to do that on your own. This bill would not affect that. I don't believe it's yet scheduled for a hearing. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Morgan.
Thank you, Diane. This is Morgan Cullen here, and I've got 6 bills to talk with you about that are have either passed or are very likely to pass, and they're all transportation, energy, or utility related. The first bill is the first bill is House Bill 1103, which was recently signed by the governor and CML supported. The legislation was actually initially pushed forward by CCI, and it would allow local governments to impose additional safety requirements for off-highway vehicles on roads that are within their jurisdiction. And it just clarifies that local governments that do impose these ordinances do so in a manner that's consistent with state rules. Apparently this issue has come up before, and counties were notified by the state that they wouldn't be eligible for grants from the State Trails Program without this legislation. So CCI put it forward. I ran it by a number of our member municipalities that cater to off-highway vehicles as a tourism draw, and they supported it as well. So we ultimately supported it. The bill's been signed by the governor. The next bill, House Bill 1285. This is titled Pay Exempt Disability Parking Placard. What it does is it reforms the way that we regulate handicap parking in the state to reduce the number of fraudulent handicap parking placards by removing the parking benefits associated with those placards. So apparently the number one reason for fraudulently using handicap parking in the state is for free parking. And under current law, all drivers with handicap parking placards don't have to pay for metered parking. This legislation removes that benefit, except for people that don't have the physical capacity to actually feed a meter. And those drivers would now receive a special placard that indicates that they qualify for free parking, and that was determined by a medical professional. This bill passed earlier in the week, passed the House unanimously, and was just introduced in the Senate. So it still has a ways to go, but high likelihood that it will pass. So it's just something to keep note of. On to Senate bills. Senate Bill 1, transportation funding. A lot of discussion has gone on, and a higher priority has been placed in both chambers on transportation funding for the state's infrastructure to the tune of up to $500 million. There's two bills. The first bill, Senate Bill 1, passed about 3 weeks out of the Senate after a strike below amendment was agreed upon by Senate Republicans and Democrats. The bill ultimately passed unanimously, was introduced into the House, and so that bill, coupled with House Bill 1340, will be the two major vehicles to determine infrastructure funding going forward during the 2018 session. I think the real sticking point between the two chambers right now has to do with where the money will go. There's been a priority placed on transferring the money straight to the state highway fund by Republicans. Democrats, on the other hand, would like to see money go back to locals from cities and counties, and then also a multimodal component as well. So that's where the debate hinges on. But it'll be very interesting to see where this plays out over the next 2.5 weeks. The next bill, Senate Bill 3, has to do with the reauthorization of the Colorado Energy Office. This bill is on its second reading in the second chamber. If you may recall, Senate Bill 301, which was Senator Ray Scott's bill last year, was a big omnibus energy package bill that also had to do with the reauthorization of the Energy Office. That bill died in the final week of session last year, and the Energy Office did not receive reauthorization. This bill reauthorizes it and then refunds the Energy Office through the long bill, and also requires that the Energy Office take an all-of-the-above approach to energy matters within the department going forward. So we expect that bill to pass and reauthorization to occur. Senate Bill 144, this is the regulation of bicycles approaching intersections. It's also known as the Idaho Stop. It would allow bikers to pass through an intersection without stopping if it's safe to do so and no cars are present. This bill has been introduced in the past, and CML has consistently opposed the bill because it was a mandate on local governments that they were required to adhere to these new Idaho stop requirements. This bill makes it an option, and all it does is sets up consistent rules that would be adopted by municipalities if they decide to do so. And we have taken a support position on that bill, and it has just passed the House. So Senate Bill 811, Senate Bill 167, which has to do with...
if we ever get to 811 Senate bills, I can...
Right.
So Senate Bill 167, also known as the 811 Reform Bill. This bill reforms the Colorado's Call Before You Dig program, and it essentially does two things. It would require Tier 1 membership of all 811 facility owners. So if you're a member, if your municipality is a Tier 2 member, it's worth noting that. The bill right now is parked in Senate appropriations, but I think it has a very high success rate of passing both chambers and being signed by the governor this year. The second thing that the bill does is it creates a 12-member safety commission, which has oversight authority over the 811 program, and really can, has the opportunity to enforce and impose penalties on both operators, facility owners, and then excavators as well that aren't adhering to the rules of the program. So this is one that's worth paying attention to as it moves forward, because it could have a direct impact on municipalities. CML has been neutral on the bill, but we've worked on several of the components associated with it. specifically some of the constitutionality issues that we found on state oversight of municipal infrastructure. Also some liability concerns regarding locates for laterals. And also we've added another amendment to ensure that this oversight commission also has the authority to look at improving efficiency of the overall and the cost effectiveness of the overall 811 program. So that is it for me, and I'm going to hand it off to Kevin.
Thanks, Morgan. Nice work. And we are on time and under budget. I'm going to talk to you about a few of my bills, and I'm going to start actually down the House bill list of ways. I'm going to start with a couple of marijuana bills, House Bills 1258 and House Bill 1259. House Bill 1258 looks like this bill may have some legs. Senate appropriations may be a little bit difficult for the proponents, but what this bill does is that local option, either by ordinance or through initiative or referendum, to allow local governments that have already opted into retail marijuana to allow, at local discretion, retail marijuana stores to have an accessory consumption establishment, a tasting room, if you will, although I don't like calling them tasting rooms because it's a completely different subject matter. But the idea is for someone to be able to have a small sample for purchase before they purchase something larger. Now, these consumption establishments would be required to be physically separated from the retail store at a distance determined locally and probably depending on where the applicant wanted to be. But again, 100% local option. The proponents have been working with the league to deal with all the objections that we had initially raised way back when the policy committee first talked about this in October, and again throughout. So the league has been neutral on that bill, listed as strongly opposed, which means we're neutral. Since the amendments were adopted in the House, again, the bill's now in Senate appropriations. It passed the Finance Committee 4-1 yesterday. We do believe that this bill has a very good shot of getting to the governor's desk. House Bill 1259, I'll just mention very briefly because we withdrew our opposition. I apologize, it still says opposed unless amended there. That is, we are neutral on the bill, and I'll get that updated. But the legislation, similar to what breweries are able to do, brewers and vintners, when they make something, they can test it, make sure it tastes good, and use that information they glean as experts on for quality control and product development. The cultivators and manufacturers of marijuana products wanted a similar provision. Right now, they actually have to sell their products to a retail store or a medical marijuana center and then buy it back before they can legally have the product, and then it's not tracked after that. This would fix that so they could, very small quantities, be able to sample their own product off-premise, not for remuneration, not for delivery, or to be given to anyone else. And we worked on amendments to be able to withdraw our opposition. That's House Bill 1259. I want to back up a second. A bill that passed, because I'm going to talk about broadband in a second, but I'll save it for Senate Bill 2. But I want to highlight House Bill 1099, which has been signed by the governor on April 2nd. I'll be mentioning that. We did support that, and I'll mention that in Senate Bill 2 coming up. So scrolling down, I want to point out another bill that has passed the House and will die in the Senate, only because of the broadband connection. We expect it to come back next year. You may be aware that the FCC repealed the Obama administration's net neutrality requirements, and so we're back to the way we were before. There have been some states that have been looking to try to do their own net neutrality. They're preempted by the FCC. The proponents of House Bill 1312 on the screen there had wanted to have a version of net neutrality that required anyone receiving a rural broadband grant to also abide by net neutral standards, otherwise they wouldn't receive the grant. That is something the state of Colorado could conceivably do in exchange for receiving a private provider receiving a grant. However, that bill's not going to pass the Senate. We do support it. It does have some problems in it, so if it's going to come back next year, we'll have to have some work done on it. That's House Bill 1312. Down to House Bill 1368. This may get some folks talking. Let me just tell you that this too is a bill that will pass the House and die in the Senate, but I want to point it out because it will come back next year, and if there's one party control of the legislature next year, this bill could very likely pass, and that is 1368, local control of minimum wage. Back in 1999, there was a bill that passed, Senate Bill 14, that purported to preempt municipalities from adopting a local minimum wage different than the state. The League didn't oppose that bill back then because of the very simple decision. We believe we're already preempted from having our own minimum wage based on previous Supreme Court decisions. If anyone ever wants to get more history on that, I can provide it. But just know that if this bill were to pass, it would put things back to the way they were in 1999 when we already thought we were preempted. This bill does one interesting thing because since 1999 we've had a constitutional amendment that's been amended once again, creating in the Constitution a escalating statewide minimum wage. Besides the argument that one can make that the state occupies the field on this now constitutionally and will preempt a municipality from having a different wage, the bill gives municipalities affirmative authority to exceed the constitutional limit, which is an important consideration. So again, this bill will not survive. If it does ever pass, though, in a form that looks like this, it would certainly be challenged on constitutional grounds and prior Supreme Court precedent. So 1368, don't get too excited about it, but pay attention for future legislation. House Bill 1381, permissive medical marijuana vertical integration. No position listed. The League will be neutral on this bill. But bottom line is that when medical marijuana came out, there was a requirement for vertical integration, but did allow for 30% of the stock in a medical marijuana center to come from outside. It was all tracked and everything. Vertical integration was very important back in 2010. This bill would allow 50-50 instead of 70-30, and eventually eliminate vertical integration altogether. From the League's perspective, this would be a statewide policy issue, not necessarily one where we'd want to have a different local standard. So we'd be neutral on the bill, but I just note this because I think it further highlights the convergence point somewhere in the future where medical and retail will converge together, and probably we won't have a distinction between the two anymore. That's House Bill 1381. And sticking with marijuana, gift that keeps on giving, House Bill 1389. This is a centralized marijuana distribution permit, and this is probably an issue that only affects the city and county of Denver because the cultivators and infused products manufacturers would be large enough to have multiple points of distribution that they want to centralize some of those activities where they're not legally able to now largely exist only in Denver. We point this out only because this bill, as introduced, represents a slight departure from the dual nature of licensing and approval that is recognized in the Constitution, and will likely be asking for at least notification before the state issues this kind of permit, but more than likely will want local authority approval. And even though it's Denver now, it could be other municipalities later if you want to be consistent on that. That is the extent of the House bills. Let me jump over to Senate bills. And I will start, as I mentioned, with broadband. Senate Bill 2, which was signed along with House Bill 1099 by the governor on April 2nd. The two together represent probably the most significant legislation in broadband, certainly since deregulation, which promised more rural broadband. This one will actually deliver it. What the bill does is repurpose high-cost support mechanism dollars. It's a fee that everyone pays on their phone bill that has traditionally been for landline support, and give them to the Broadband Deployment Board and the Department of Regulatory Agencies. We have municipal representation on that board. Mayor Karen Sheik, who's the mayor of Cortez, is on that board, along with several other representatives, and they receive applications from private telecom providers for telecommunications or broadband infrastructure grants, and now they'll have tens of millions of dollars over the next few years to be able to provide those grants. This bill had trouble out of the gate. We supported it. Once it got into the House with some amendments, made it even better, ensuring higher speeds would be required, and along with 1099, which requires a incumbent provider that is exercising a right of first refusal to take over a grant to provide either the same or better speeds at the same or lower cost. The two bills together are great improvement in broadband funding, and rural Colorado should greatly benefit from that. So that is Senate Bill 2. A couple of beer and liquor bills that were signed into law, actually one in particular signed into law earlier in the year. That is Senate Bill 67. On March 1st, it was signed into law. This allows nonprofits to be able to actually give folks donated liquor that they auction in, say, a fundraiser or something like that, when they're holding the event on a licensed premise. Because of the way that our liquor laws are in Colorado, very complicated, we'll talk about that more in a second. If you bid on a bottle of wine at an auction and you happen to be in an event center that had a license for on-premise consumption, you couldn't actually receive that bottle of wine that you won or the gift basket. You had to go out in the parking lot out of the licensed premise. So that bill was signed. It became effective on the date of the signature, so I wanted to point that one out. That'll be of particular interest to clerks in issuing special event permits. So that was earlier legislation. Let me move down now to beer and liquor bills. I'm going to point out Senate Bill 198, and then I'm going to go by it and talk about it in conjunction with Senate Bill 243 down below. As folks may know, Senate Bill 197 in 2016 changed the landscape of liquor licensing really forever in Colorado by allowing, in order to stem what were going to be likely ballot initiatives that would have given grocery stores the ability to sell beer, wine, and spirits. There was a deal cut, and then pretty much immediately after that, everyone started disagreeing with parts of the deal that they had made, and that's in the industry ranks. What Senate Bill 198 does, and what Senate Bill 243 do, is attempt to undo and change some of those provisions and add some new ones. Senate Bill 198 represents a proposal from the Licensed Beverage Association on how to handle new fermented malt beverage licenses. Those are convenience stores and grocery stores, fermented malt beverage being 3.2, but thanks to Senate Bill 197, 3.2 beer becomes full-strength beer. Fermented malt beverage licensees can sell full-strength beer beginning on 1/1/19. So I'm going to just stick a pin in 198 because that one is likely to die when it's heard in Senate State Affairs on Monday. I'm going to talk about 243. So I'll scroll down to that. 243 was just introduced, and this is, for lack of a better word, an omnibus liquor bill. It actually has some things that CML asked for. It has some things we don't like and a whole bunch of stuff that we're indifferent on because it's going to be World War III in the liquor industry. I'll distill this down, pun intended, to a couple of key points. We have asked for a 500-foot distance restriction for future fermented malt beverage licenses from schools. Every other liquor license has a 500-foot distance restriction, which local governments can waive or reduce. And so we need that going forward. That's part of this bill, along with a couple other things. The bill also represents a significant departure from 197 that is likely going to doom the bill. And I'll have more to write about in some of those details because they're too numerous to mention here when we do State House report on Friday. But 243 is also being heard in State Affairs on Monday. It's being heard first. You can see one in the Senate calendar. And if it passes, then, and I believe that it will, then Senate Bill 198 will be asked to be killed, because Senate Bill 243 will be the vehicle. Whether or not Senate Bill 243, if it passes committee, passes the Senate floor, is highly in doubt, and it will be industry fighting with industry. Because of that, and because the 500 foot from schools is very important to us, the league has, this is no secret, we're very transparent about it, has been pursuing a late bill. Yes, I know there's 21 days left, but a late bill that would specifically deal with the 500 foot distance restriction. It's our insurance policy to ensure that we have that authority and won't have room under the bill title for any of this other nonsense that is likely to die if 243 doesn't make it. So a whole lot going on with beer and liquor here at the very end, and I just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of that. Stay tuned, because it will impact existing licensees one way or the other in your jurisdiction. I would note that our 500 foot distance restriction proposal is only prospective. It would not impact any grocery stores or convenience stores, anyone with a 3-2 license for off-premise consumption that's already within 500 feet of the school. They've been grandfathered. And scroll back up to Senate Bill 200. Para-member municipalities are well aware of what's going on with, there's 27 of you, are well aware of what's going on with para legislation, trying to deal with the significant, somewhere between $32 and $50 billion unfunded liability of para, depending whose numbers you subscribe to. The great news is the local government division, 27 member municipalities are in a much better position. We've been able to secure some amendments that are beneficial to both the employer and the employees in that division. We believe they'll stick if the House and Senate can come to a deal on that. I just want to point that out because we do dabble in pension issues. Diane has been tag teaming this with me along. She's been taking over. You'll see on our bill log, bills dealing with Fire and Police Pension Association that she dealt with. So we do keep an eye on retirement and pension issues as well. Okay, almost done. Finish line in sight. I mentioned 243. Let me just also mention 248 because if anyone didn't know this was coming and saw that there was yet another bill about urban renewal, tax income refinancing, and that impacts you, you might have fallen out of your chair. Let me just say that this is compromise legislation. The CML, CCI, and the County Assessors Association have worked with collaboratively to deal with a very specific issue that CML was actually supportive of in legislation that we had proposed to address urban renewal a couple of years ago, and that is the ability for counties and special districts that approve mill levy increases or whatever after an urban renewal plan is established to not have that additional revenue counted towards the increment of the urban renewal authority or the project and plan. Obviously, prospectively, because you can't do that retroactively as those bond revenues are pledged. It was hard for the assessors to be able to determine the actual increment on that, and also revenues, additional revenues related to debursings. And so this legislation puts it back to the municipality and or the urban renewal authority to work to agreement with the county school district and or special districts on how those will be handled. Again, prospectively for new plans after January 1st, 2016. Anyone in that 2.5 year gap between 1/1/16 and now that doesn't have that in their plan agreement will likely have to go back and make some adjustments to deal with that. But as long as it doesn't impact pledged revenue, that's not a problem. So that is Senate Bill 248. That is the end of the bills that we were talking about, and I'm going to look to see if there are any questions. I don't see any, so let us just take a 1-minute break, and if you have any questions about any bills that CML covered or didn't cover, I'd be happy to do that. I see one from Wanda asking about Senate Bill 242, if that has been signed. 242. Back to 242. Diane, that's yours. That's a public official oath of office. No, Wanda, that bill, number one, as being heard today in the Senate State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee, it will pass that committee, it will pass the Senate. I can't think of any path forward on that bill in the House. So not only will it not be signed, we believe it will be killed. If not before it gets to the House, certainly in the House. And Diane is nodding her head and agreeing with that. Take a couple minutes and see if there's any other questions.
While you're thinking about your questions, this is Lisa again. I just want to remind you about the annual conference, June 19th through 22nd in Vail this year. Hope you'll be able to join us. It's going to be a fantastic event filled with sessions on all of the topics that are of interest to you, as well as some great networking opportunities as well. So make sure you register. I believe the early registration deadline is May 4th, so please register. We also have our spring outreach meetings are scheduled. Those are going to take place in May. If you go to our website, cml.org, and then I believe Kevin is doing it as we speak. So if you go to events and then click on outreach, you'll see where we'll be. And we sure hope you'll be able to join us. As you'll see, CML staff, we travel around the state. We look forward to meeting and connecting with you all. The locations that have the asterisks actually includes a free effective governance abbreviated workshop that we'll be doing. We'll be doing 3 of those, one in Frisco, Kit Carson, and Windsor. So we sure hope that your elected officials, especially those newly electeds, will be able to potentially join us.
And if you think we're fun on a webinar, you ought to see us in
Woohoo!
Any other questions? We're in a little early, so we'll make sure we give everyone an opportunity to ask anything related to legislation or anything else you want to talk about. I guess it's open mic time.
It absolutely is. And remember, anytime you have questions or something comes to mind, don't ever hesitate to give us a holler, send us an email, pick up the phone. I'm always here to help answer any questions you have and be of support to you.
All right, well, I guess that's it then. If you think of anything afterwards or anything else comes up, of course, you can always email us on that legislative page. You can go to the main page and get our email addresses. We're out there. And ask us anything, updates, whatever. And again, look for the State House report on Friday. We'll update folks on bills that we covered today, latest status, as well as any new developments. I think that's it.
Thank you all so much for participating. Hope you have a great afternoon.